My name is Sage Furman, here with Chase Furman, Magnus Bush, and Kate Sangster. We're from Da Vinci Charter Academy, and we're interviewing Sam Gross. It's November 21st, 2016, here in Danville, California. Okay. Hi, Sam. So let's get off to the basics. What were your early days of service like?
Well, I started at Lackland Air Force Base as everyone else did. Prior to that, I was really nervous going in because at the time the draft was in progress and I had already received my draft notice to go into the Army. And I really didn't want to wind up in Vietnam, so I talked with my sister and my mom and decided to enlist in the Air Force instead. So within 2 weeks of enlisting, I was already shipped off to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, and that's where all of the basic training took care of. Now, mind you, I was 18 years old, right out of high school. I had started college at Chabot Junior College, but obviously I didn't have enough for student deferment, so that's why I would have been drafted into the Army. Being there was a little intimidating because even though I had grown up in a pretty rough neighborhood in Oakland, California, I was still a little bit intimidated because most of the guys that I went in with were much bigger than I was. I mean, looking at me now, when I went to Vietnam, I weighed 140 pounds and I was about 5'10", 5'11". So I was a real skinny guy and not real sure of how to take it. When we got to Lackland Air Force Base, we got off the bus and they all put us in a line at attention. And the drill sergeant came up to the first guy, the biggest guy in the unit, punched him in the gut, doubled him over, and he said, "You're here to learn. I'm here to give the punishment. So don't screw up." So that was pretty intimidating right then and there. So nobody really made a mistake. Nobody wanted to make a mistake. They didn't classify us in any shape or manner. I mean, we had a couple of Hispanic guys, a couple of black guys, Asian guys. It didn't matter who you were. You were all considered what they called lackeys for Lackland Air Force Base. And that was pretty intimidating for the first couple of weeks. But after getting in and learning and marching, running, physical training, KP duty, it all became pretty normal. So after basic training, we went through a battery of testing to see what our called MOS, which is Military Operating Specialist field, would be. And I originally wanted to go into electronics because that's what I had started studying at Chabot. But all those fields were taken, so I accepted a position into the air traffic unit, which I didn't know anything about at the time, but I thought it'd be interesting and I qualified for it. So after basic training, we went to Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi. And keep in mind that this was in the 1970s, 1969, 1970 when I got there. And Keesler Air Force Base, Mississippi is in the deep south. When I got there, we were in these old World War II style barracks, double bunked, and my bunkmate was a 6'5", 230-pound black guy who I befriended very quickly to be my friend, and we got along really great. And going through the school, I never gave it a second of thought. It was almost like a college atmosphere at that point. You had instructors. Once you got out of basic training, you were pretty much in, and you really didn't, unless you got yourself into trouble, you would be okay. So my early days, I would say, were a little intimidating at first, but I quickly got over it.
Did you make most of your friends in training camp, or did you make them while you were in the Air Force?
Well, most of my friends I had made at an early age. My father left the family when I was 12. I belonged to a Jewish youth organization growing up, and that's where most of my friends were at that time, all through high school. And as a side note, even as of today, 50 years later, we still meet once a year and play golf together, as many of us as we can find. And we just got done with a trip. Some of the friends that I made while I was in the Air Force, lost touch with them. A lot of them moved on with their lives as I did. There were two friends in particular that I stayed in touch with, and one happened to, just until recently, lived about a mile from here, which was kind of nice. And the other guy lives over in Half Moon Bay with another friend of mine that was in the Army. So we see each other regularly for that, and we talk about it from time to time. But as far as most of my friends in the Air Force, really didn't have an opportunity to make close friends because you were getting reassigned all the time because of the war. They would move you around to give you experience. So for me, my first assignment was at Vandenberg Air Force Base in a tower. And then I went to Beale Air Force Base in a radar unit and then got deployed to Vietnam anyway. But it was in the Air Force where I learned how to fly an airplane. And I had an opportunity as a result of an incident that occurred flying privately while at Vandenberg, where I made an emergency landing, saved the airplane and myself, and they gave me an opportunity to go into a program to become an officer. But I knew right away what they were after, and that was to get me to fly F-4s in Vietnam. And I didn't want to do that, so I turned it down. But I wound up over there anyway. It was myself, actually my roommate at Vandenberg, or Beale rather, and we both got orders to go to Vietnam, only two in our squadron.
So you said you enlisted.
I did.
Why did you choose the Air Force?
Well, as I said, when I started school at Chabot, my interest was electronics. I didn't feel the Army would give me any benefit. I didn't feel the Marines would give me a benefit in that. So the only two left would be the Navy and the Air Force. I thought about the Navy and then felt that if I went into electronics in the Navy, I'd be on a ship somewhere. And I didn't mind ships at all, but I would rather be in the Air Force on a land base where I could move about and do things on my own and not be at sea so often.
Do you recall your instructors?
I do. The drill sergeant at Lackland Air Force Base, his first name was Robert, and I believe his last name was Dunham. And I remember him because of what happened, and I can still picture his face today. Even though he did what he did, he wasn't the type of drill sergeant that was ever demeaning or called you names. Like some of the movies you hear them calling you all these different kind of names. It was more about getting in your face and yelling using high voices and getting you to pay attention and stay at attention without moving or being disrupted or distracted. And when you look back at something like that, there was a reason for that, because they wanted you to focus on whatever it was. And by yelling and screaming, if you got distracted, they would think that, well, if you're distracted by somebody yelling and screaming at you, how distracted are you going to be, if you ever did go to combat or in a stressful situation.
So how do you think you adapted to military life overall?
Well, I think I adapted fairly well. I was an emancipated minor at age 15. I was living on my own at age 16. So having to fend for myself at an early age kind of, I would say, prepared me for military life, because you were pretty much on your own and you had to fend for yourself, think for yourself, do for yourself, make sure you got up on time, didn't have any parents getting me out of bed. So you had all of these responsibilities being in the military. But keep in mind, it was a different time back then than it is now, a different generation, where even back then, prior to going in the military, you had to do things on your own. if you wanted to get things done.
And what were some specific places you served in?
My first air base was Vandenberg Air Force Base. I then went up to Beale Air Force Base for a very short time. Went to Phu Quoc Air Base, Vietnam. While at Phu Quoc, and we attached to the first mob would go to a province called Pleiku, which in the late 60s was under attack all the time, and it wasn't until after I got there that it had settled down some. After there, I got reassigned to Altus Air Force Base in Oklahoma, and that's where I got discharged.
So, you said you served abroad. Do you have any specifically bad or good memories associated with any of the air bases you served at?
Well, I think Vandenberg was a missile base. So the memory from there was that it was a very open base, and I had a car, so that gave me the liberty to go where I needed to go when I wanted to go. And I think the best memory I had there, because I had started playing golf at Vandenberg Air Force Base, and they had a beautiful golf course, and you didn't have to pay for it. You just went out and played. So the memory of that air base was really good. I never had any bad experience. The only experience I think bad experience I had there, and I'll share one other story with you, was when we would get food, it would be transported from the mess hall to us, and it would come in a carrying case where you had 6 or 7 plates, and each plate had the meal on it, and they were hot plates, and you would carry this thing. And we didn't have elevators, so you're climbing up 7 stories and stairs, and I had slipped, and the plates went flying. There was food everywhere. It took me a few hours to clean everything up. So that's probably the worst experience I had. The best experience I had while working was we had a aircraft coming in, and I had cleared the aircraft to land. And in the Air Force, there was a requirement to pick up a pair of binoculars to verify that the aircraft's landing gear was down. And in this case, the gear wasn't down, so I had instructed the pilot to check wheels down. And he said, my gear is down, and I instructed him that it wasn't, and he kept assuring me that it was, so I had to cancel his landing clearance at the last minute because he was going to land with no gear. And I was later given a commendation medal and awarded a safe certificate for that. So that was a really good experience, knowing that I saved an aircraft from crashing. So that was a really good experience. I think the only bad experience I had, I had a couple of bad experiences in Vietnam. After I got there, we had gone over to Pleiku to set up a tower unit there, and the LZ, the landing zone, was supposedly cleared already. We went down, the equipment was already there, and as soon as we got the equipment, we came under heavy fire. A couple of guys that I was with got hit, one got killed, so that was pretty traumatic for me, knowing that. So that was a bad experience for me. I didn't see it, but still pretty traumatic. The only other bad experience I had was, I wouldn't call it an experience. It wasn't a combat issue. It was more of how our air base treated the local Vietnamese villagers there. They had employed a lot of these villagers to come in and work on the air base, and they treated them as servants, if you will, where they would come in and they would work. They would get paid, for their job, but they still treated them like I would consider second-class citizens. So I didn't appreciate that. I would try to give some of these people. You couldn't give them the money because it would be taken from them when they exited the base. But we tried to sneak in socks, pillowcases, excuse me, things like that.
So did you interact a lot with the Vietnamese people?
I wouldn't say interact, except, for seeing them on the base, working in the various shops in the mess hall. Excuse me just a second. Oh, gee, a little tickle.
So what combat act, you said you witnessed some sort of combat action, but can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, at Phuket, our radar facility was at the edge of the runway perimeter. And we had other members of a different unit that were supposed to go out and calibrate our radar on a daily basis. Well, almost all of them were sick, some various form of illness or whatever. And we were trained to calibrate our own equipment. So we had gone out, and normally we would go out with usually 3 or 4 soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division would go with us to provide cover for us, and they would go in first to make sure the area was clear. Well, we got it. Excuse me. We got out there and got the okay signal to go out to the unit. And I got out there, and I had an M16 rifle. We're wearing flak jackets, and as soon as I got up on top of the radar unit, we started taking fire. I literally jumped off of the top of the radar unit, which was probably a good 10-foot drop, 10 to 12 feet. Rolled, was taking fire, and then got behind a what they call bunker barrier that would surround the area. And we took quite a bit of fire, fired back. Somebody in one of the Army guys called for some backup, and we had a Korean Army compound with us, so they sent out a squad of Koreans outside the perimeter, and within about 10 minutes, it was done. They had taken everybody out.
So how did you feel witnessing combat or casualties?
Not ever seeing anybody killed, or hearing about it or being part of it. It gives you pause. I didn't get sick or anything, but even though it's an enemy, it's still a human life. And even back then, I wasn't a conscientious objector or anything like that, but it's hard to take another life. But when you are faced with death yourself, you're going to take action. That's just the way it was.
Yeah, so what kinds of friendships and camaraderie did you form while serving?
Well, our unit was pretty tight. We had 15 guys in our unit. We slept in the same barracks. We ate pretty much at the same time. We never went anywhere on base by yourself, pretty much. You always went with somebody else, and you're always carrying a weapon.
So with whom did you really form strong bonds with?
Well, my roommate, for sure. Excuse me, I got a tickle here. It's in the refrigerator, right-hand side. Thank you. His name was Woody Harris, and that was his real name. Woody and I became really, really close. And thank you very much. Excuse me. Woody and I became very close. Even after we got back from Vietnam, we stayed in touch. And that's one of the guys that lives over in Half Moon Bay. We exchanged letters. We would get the care package from home with all the broken cookies and everything, and eat those. We had what we called a flight facilities officer who took really good care of us. He was a lieutenant. His last name was Houghton Cooper. And it was kind of an interesting relationship because he was German and I was Jewish. But it didn't matter. He was always took care of us, made sure that we had whatever we needed. made sure all of our equipment would be working. So I kind of took a liking to that gentleman, and he was pretty instrumental. When my tour was up in Vietnam, I was supposed to go to Thailand to train other people, and he was pretty instrumental in getting me back home. So I was real favorite of him. The other people we got close to were the pilots, especially the pilots that brought in supplies. Because of what we did, our radar unit and the air traffic control towers were air conditioned. So it was real important that we didn't go from air conditioning to the weather elements in Vietnam, which is very hot and very humid, and go back and forth and become ill, because that's how you would get sick. So we were fortunate to be in air-conditioned barracks, which was kind of neat. So we befriended all these pilots that would come in, and they would stay with us. So because of that, they would bring us stuff from the States. So it was kind of cool.
How did you stay in touch with family while you were in Vietnam?
Well, good question.
Or did you?
Yeah, we did. You had to go to what they called a MARS unit, mobile something radio station, and long lines. There were days where you could be in line for hours and not be able to make a call, and the calls were predicated on ham operators being, here stateside to pick up your call. So it was a combination of getting in line, and if our unit was down, then you could make calls. If they couldn't pick up a ham station close by, you could make a call. Your calls were limited to about 5 minutes, if that. And it was always, you always had to say over at the end. So it was kind of clumsy to tell your wife, and I was married. I got married just before I left. So it's kind of hard to say, honey, I love you, over. That kind of thing. It was kind of a funny thing. But that's how we communicated. I mean, I wrote letters a lot, but mail was slow.
So besides having the time to call your family, what did you do for recreation when you were off duty?
Well, we didn't have any recreation, so to speak. It was pretty much confined to base. There was a small basketball gym that they had erected. You really couldn't go running or anything. They didn't. Some of the bases were really nice. For instance, Cam Ranh Bay, which was in South Vietnam, was the intake base, and it was heavily protected. I mean, they had a bowling alley. You could go water skiing. You could do all these things, but not where we were at.
What would you say the best experience you had while you were serving was?
I think the best experience I had over there was the fact that at the time we were training the South Vietnamese Air Force to do our jobs. And I think the best time I had was training those people who were would relate to us how sad they were that their country was being torn apart by this civil war. But I think the friendships I made with them were great. I did keep in touch with two of the officers that I had trained. Excuse me. And they had since passed away.
Did you know what you were fighting for when you were in Vietnam?
Well, at the very beginning, everybody heard about, the war in Vietnam, and, that we're a bunch of baby killers and things like that, and that it's a war that is never going to be won, which was probably true. That's why the French got out when they did, because they realized that they weren't ever going to win anything. But a lot of people thought it was the United States delving into somebody else's affairs where we shouldn't have. But realistically, not even looking back hindsight, I kind of knew that because one of my passions in education was history. I loved history. And a lot of the young guys that went over there really had no idea what was really at stake if South Vietnamese fell to the communists. It would give the communists a foothold on all of the Southeast borders, the Southeast Asia border, China all the way down would have been communist, and it could have changed history. Nobody will ever know. But I kind of knew that was why I was over there, to help support that. And also to, at the time I went over there, in the later part, obviously, was to train the South Vietnamese Army and Air Force.
You said that people called you baby killers. How did people react to you, and how did they treat you when you came back from the war?
Well, just like that. I mean, it was, other than my close friends, but people found out I was a Vietnam War vet coming back. You would hear it all the time. I remember going to a dinner a year later for our squadron dinner. Excuse me. And there were still protesters then, calling us baby killers, throwing stuff at us. You'd read about it in the paper, and that bothered me a lot. And it took me about 2 years to get through that. I never got counseling or anything, but my wife was very instrumental in helping me through that area. Now I look back upon that time, and I can understand why they were saying what they were doing, but it's still something today when we have our troops coming home from a war. I understand their right to say whatever they want to say, but I don't think a lot of them understand that the troops that fight in these conflicts are preserving their right to do that.
Where were you when the war officially ended and the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam?
Where was I? I was in San Leandro. I mean, we had not started a family yet. I think by the time the war came to end, I think my son was born in '76, so that was about the time that, just after the war had ended. So we were in San Leandro in a home. I was working for the government at the time.
How were you when you returned home? Did you receive any injuries during your service?
No.
No?
But it did take me 2 years to eat rice again, because we had rice with every meal.
So I know a common thing that was used during Vietnam was Agent Orange. Did that affect you at all?
I don't know that it affected me at all. I can't say that it has. I was tested. I do have VA benefits for it, should I need it. So I think that when I got tested, when I signed up for my VA benefits, they took blood, urine, and all of that. But the fact that we were in areas where Agent Orange was dropped was just enough for them to classify me as being exposed to it. And I'm pretty sure we were when we were in the Pleiku area and going through those areas closer to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, because that's where everything was dropped. So I imagine that I was exposed to it either through airborne or through touch of foliage that we had happened to go through. But I can't say that, that it's affected me at this point. I mean, I've had a very good career with the Sheriff's Department, with the federal government. So I really can't say that it's affected me that much. Of course, if you ask my wife, she'd probably say yes.
Did you struggle at all with readjusting to civilian life when you came back?
Yeah, about 2 years. It was hard. Thinking about that I was home and some of my colleagues were still there fighting, dying. And I had friends that were here that went into the Army that got killed. So just knowing that was, you had a little guilt feeling that I'm here and they're still there. And I think that's why even today, some of the guys that come back from Afghanistan or some of the other countries that we're in conflict with want to go back for a second, even a third tour, because they feel guilty that they're here and their brethren are still over there.
Have you remained in contact with some of your fellow veterans?
I have, a lot. As a matter of fact, we went to a presentation in Concord just recently where they had a town hall meeting, if you will, for all veterans of foreign conflicts. So we do that about every year. We go up there.
Are you a member of any veterans organizations?
Yes, I belong to Veterans of Foreign Wars, American Legion.
Okay. Have you done anything since separating from the military? I mean, obviously, but.
Well, I got out, and the military was kind enough to give me a career in air traffic, so I went to work probably about a year after I got out. I went back to college to work on my degree, and I finally got a notice from the FAA wanting to hire me as an air traffic controller. And I did that until 1981. And you're probably too young to remember the air traffic controller strike of 1981, but I got fired by the President of the United States. Aren't too many people that can say that. We went on strike against the government. I was a pilot at the time, so I started flight instruction, and then in 1983, I went to work for the Alameda County Sheriff's Department. I was their chief pilot, and my last 6 years, I was a sergeant in the narcotics division, and until I got a phone call in 1998. In 1995, I got a letter from President Clinton wanting to know if I wanted to go back to work for the FAA. So I'm discussing this with my wife, being able to get 2 retirements. I said yes. So I went back, took 3 years, but I got back in 1998, and I retired from that in 2014.
How would you say your wartime experiences affected or changed your life afterwards?
I think the experience of going through the military gave me more discipline than I had when I went in. Gave me a career. It changed me to a point where not to take life for granted, and to be kind to anybody, no matter where they were from.
What are some life lessons you learned from your military service?
I would say just the last one, being around people from another country got me to thinking about how they lived, how they were brought up, which helped me afterward because I went back to college. I studied world religion, religions of man. I studied Buddhism, Taoism, Catholicism, Judaism, all of the different religions to see how it interacted. And it was surprising to see that there wasn't much difference between these religions, and to respect people for who they are and not to stereotype people just because of who they are or where they come from.
How would you say your military service impacted your feelings towards war and the military in general?
I don't know that it impacted my feelings one way or the other. As I said, delving into history, the world has been at war since, 4000 BC, if you want to go back that far. And we're always going to have conflict. And the reason we're going to have conflict is because people have different views on how things should be perceived and how things should be done. And as long as there is a balance, and if you will, the yin and the yang, as long as there is a balance of power, then hopefully we can try to mitigate loss of life through some of these conflicts. And the more diplomatic resolve that we can get versus armed conflict, the better. But you're always going to have extremists that are going to try to upset that balance of power. And that's, we have ISIS now and things like that. But I think the world is realizing that we are resolving more of our conflicts diplomatically, and we're going to handle the extremists as we should with anything else.
So going way back, do you have any siblings when you were growing up, and did they serve in the military?
I did. My older sister did not serve in the military. She became a doctor, and she is now the director of nursing at University of Oregon. I have a younger brother that did not serve. He was medically disqualified from serving, but he is a successful businessman. He has a towing company that he owns. So I have no ill regard that they didn't serve. I mean, that was their choice. And you have to understand also, by the time my brother, he's 10 years younger than I am, there was no draft. And there was really no reason for him to enter military service.
Is there anything you feel like we haven't discussed thoroughly, or anything you'd like to mention about any part of this discussion?
No, I can't think of anything. I think you were very thorough in your questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my experiences with you.
Well, thank you very much then.
Thank you for your service.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. You shared some really great things.